you very much, Annette, for that introduction. And thank you very much for mentioning the June Cummins book, which is a very important book since June was a beloved colleague and friend for many years. I'm going to start by showing the offending video, the murdering video.
Grey, haunted-eyed, absent-mindedly glaring from wide, uneven orbits, one brow drooping somewhat over the eye, because of the missile plate still in theory, skin deep, with a foolish record of old world fighting. Crookedly broken nose, no technical, cheeks furrowed, coarse grey hair flying from it, forehead wrinkled and high, jowls pumped, ears large, jaw pugilistic, teeth few, lips full and bright, mouth thin. I pause with greater poise, cowering derision of the miller's man whose beard leads my attention, and once more ask him why he still stands ready, the boy's presumption, to court the queen in her highly built pavilion.
We can all agree that while there is something satisfying about watching a person shave, the film is kind of silly. It's clearly a casual production to which Robert Graves is lending himself affably, so one can't fairly criticize its artistic shortcomings. But it possesses authority because it is visual, and because it includes the poet himself. And so it's fair to ask how the visual representation conditions our interpretation of this poem. The face in the mirror is straightforward yet difficult, concerned with, among other things, the theme of the aging poet, who, while cognizant of his failings, aspires to poetic favor. This theme appears frequently in Graves's abuse poems of this period, when he was in his 60s. But this particular poem shows the influence of the Garland of Laurel by the Tudor poet John Skelton, in which the inebriated poet dreams he is stumbling around in a damp forest, searching for the poet's palace of fame, also described as a pavilion. The Garland of Laurel is not about drunkenness, and the face in the mirror is not about a face. I'll say what I think the poem is about as a basis for critiquing the film, with some implications about the limitations and strengths of visual interpretation in poetry. The first two stanzas of the three-stanza poem contemplate facial features, which the title tells us appear in reflection. The liminality of mirrors permits us to ask whether the ontological nature of the face is uncertain. It could exist in the world, but it might not. It may just be an intentional object, something being thought about. Almost without exception, every feature is damaged or imperfect. Eyes are haunted, the eye sockets asymmetrical, the brow is scarred, the nose broken, teeth missing. The undamaged parts are equally contemptible. There is nothing beautiful or promising about this face, just as there is nothing beautiful or promising about these stanzas. Both face and poem fall short of an ideal. In stanza 3, the poet persona acts. He scowls at the mirrored man, ostensibly because he requires barbering. But the accretion of detail suggests it is because the mirrored man clings to hope of something better in a world that has damaged and hurt and will certainly kill him. As he scowls, the poet persona holds a razor. As Peter MacDonald notes in a 2012 issue of Gravesiana, there is something menacing about that razor. It resembles a weapon, and it can offer a solution to someone who wants to cut himself off from foolish or inappropriate longings. And why should the mirrored man hope? Why should he long to court the queen in her high silk pavilion, as the poem elegantly puts it? If the world can only offer disfigurement and proof of one's inadequacy, what is there to hope for? One hint about the grounds for hope is supplied by the poem's geography. Stanzas 1 and 2 identify existence with the physical ground, the ball field and the battlefield. But stanza 3 reorients us. The mirror world, the heterotopia or locus arcanum of the poem, lifts our vision so we can see and imagine we see the queen in her high silk pavilion. The lowliness of this world can be transvalued through the medium of the material text, the mirror, which the white goddess, another elegant name Graves gives to the same catalytic agent may charge with poetic truth or rich, unassailable meaning. The text is and is not poetry. It's mere materiality, and yet this gross aspect of text is indispensable to the poetic, which is different from, in kind, and yet transcends it. This coincidence of identity reflects the poem's central paradox, which resonates throughout its language and imagery. The scowling man reasonably derides presumption, yet presumption coexists with the miraculous capacity to have visions and be inspired. Presumption is itself a kind of contronym, meaning both effrontery, another aspect of imperfection, and praesumptio, a taking before, which breathes in the inspiratio, or breath of the muse, perfection itself. The poet persona is both ageless dreamer and grizzled campaigner. So, if it does, how does this film represent all that? Well, one area in which the film betrays the poem is in the depiction of space. The actions of the poem are situated in a heterotopia, a world within a world that reflects and yet transvalues what is outside it. The poem itself is the heterotopia. Its fluidity changes us, poet and reader, or as Jerome Rothenberg put it, writing of poetics, it changes our sense of being in the world. Outside of its boundaries, if there are boundaries, history is meaningless, incoherent. Inside, we can perceive order or being. The film ignores the heterotopic aspect of poetic space. It catastrophically stages the action in the most unpoetic of spaces. It shows us the mirror, but never brings us inside it. We remain an audience only. The external details on which it focuses attention, the tub, the Cro-Magnon toolkit on the ledge, rug, brush, towel, razor, reinforce the quotidian, suggesting the physical is the reality, almost to the point of absurdity. This is a scene from a light comedy. Similarly, the film mismanages time of day. Read literally, the poem seems to be implying the poet persona is readying himself for some evening engagement. The sudden appearance of the moon also implies that the time is evening or dusk. If so, then the moon is a waxing moon, hence a symbol of renewal, which challenges the foregoing seemingly concrete evidence of physical decline. By contrast, the film shows the poet performing his morning ablutions. Traditionally, evening is indeterminate, carrying associations with mystery, vision, the ineffable. Morning with rationality, sobriety, for some, shaving. The moon in the morning sky is a waning moon, chalky, inconspicuous. So the symbolism of promise disappears. It's doubtful the morning sky has ever evoked visions of a high silk pavilion. So the film suppresses the poem's climactic revelation. The film's treatment of face, the poem's primary object of attention, is unhelpful. looking into the poem's final idiomatic phrase, "Court the queen in her high silk pavilion," which, coming in the poem's concluding lines, not only turns it explicitly toward metaphor, but reveals it has always been metaphorical, might help explain why. The poet is not actually going courting in the sense of paying amorous attention to. Courting merely provides a metaphorical hinge. We know from his published criticism that Graves habitually and persistently consulted the dictionary, and the OED supplies a notably similar usage in Thomas Fuller's The History of the Holy War, 1639. Never would he have had the face to have courted the crown imperial. Fuller's courted the crown imperial is likely the antecedent of courting the queen in her high silk pavilion, and his figurative usage of face helps contextualize Graves's imagery. Fuller's full sentence, not quoted in the OED, is even more enlightening. Never would he have had the face to have courted the crown imperial if these his travels had not put boldness and audacity into him, which made him afterwards a stiff rival to bid for the Empire of Germany. Like the prince in the history, Graves has gained face, or redeemed boyish presumption through worldly experience, shin bone to nose, steel to eye, which taught him to stand ready like a courtier poet, simultaneously prepared for blows and inspiration. There is a strong suggestion in The Face in the Mirror, in the word "inhering" on line 4, that suffering is indispensable to his poetic abilities. Just after he tells us the eyes are haunted, he says one eyebrow is drooping somewhat over the other because of a missile fragment still inhering. The OED records a usage of inhere to remain in mystical union with a divine person. This missile fragment inhering in Graves's eyebrow may possess a divine property as well, a figure reminiscent of an allegorical poem from Graves's 20s, The Gnat. In The Gnat, an insect has clawed its way into a shepherd's skull through the ear. The beleaguered shepherd, Watkins, madly wielding an axe in his small hut to rid himself of the gnat, accidentally slays his sheepdog, and therefore he can no longer be a shepherd. In The Meaning of Dreams, 1924, Graves explains that the gnat illustrates a personal dilemma. After the war, he worried that if he cured his shell shock, he'd lose the capacity to write poems. He would cease to be a poet. Like the insect, the missile fragment inhering in The Face in the Mirror, I think with mythic overtones of a wound, is a gross irritant that is nonetheless essential to being a poet. Hence, the poet is marked by disfigured flesh, a disfigured self, maybe like Homer, a kind of blindness. The same equation appears a few years after The Face in the Mirror to begin the poem Food of the Dead. Blush as you stroke the curves, chin, lips, and brow of your scarred face, Prince Orpheus, for she has called it beautiful. The film shears off the poem's argument about poetic inspiration and mutilation, focusing purely cosmetic attention on the anatomical face. It asserts, in essence, that's Robert Graves in his bathrobe. That's the voice of Graves. That's Robert Graves' face. The humorous approach comports with the purpose of the film, which was made for a BBC program about Graves. But in foregrounding personality or celebrity, it privileges a heroic caricature of the poet at the expense of the poetry. In the process, it directly contradicts the poem's equivocal attitude towards society's Robert Graves. The poem, just as it deprecates physical handsomeness, the not truly beautiful, deprivileges identity, beginning with the title The Face in the Mirror, preferring the face to my face. The poem challenges ordinary assumptions of a fixed unitary self that persists through time and presents the self instead in three discrete characterizations: face in the mirror, the mirrored man, and the presumptuous boy. By giving each a measure of autonomy, the poem implies that what appears to be the solidity of the self is contingent and illusory. It nudges us toward this idea with the surprising haunted in the opening line. Everything we see in the poem, we see through haunted eyes, both Graves's and our own. Thus, nothing is necessarily what it appears. The mirror warns us that we are the unreliable narrator of our own heterotopia. Challenging romantic individualism, it suggests that being is conferred on us only through inspiration. And the mysterious source of inspiration is she who can make scars beautiful and turn the material text, this gross and ungainly list of features, which, by the way, map to the senses, and historical fragments into poetry. So, on reflection, the poem answers its own question. What is there to hope for? What is there for the poet to hope for? Inspiration, or being, despite and in some sense because of admitted unworthiness. The film misses the point so badly, one almost has to ask, would it be much different if instead of reciting the poem, Robert Graves were whistling? Although it misrepresents and trivializes the poem, obliterates the clues that might point us toward a more exciting interpretation, and sacrifices the poem's arguments to comical visual spectacle, a case can be made that the film succeeds in a couple of ways. I like it as a documentary or historical footage. Here is a soldier poet who in his teens and early 20s survived the trenches, now snug in a bathrobe, busying himself with safe worldly tasks like shaving, in glorious black and white. One must think of the many soldiers who weren't as lucky. But there's more to it than that, I'll argue. The arresting opening shot of Graves walking barefooted, an image of ease but also of vulnerability, even perhaps a reference to boyhood, nicely suggests the idea of the man standing ready with the boy's presumption. Here is a poet of advanced years risking his dignity for the sake of uncertain aesthetic enterprise. He appears to be vigorous, but that is poignant. He is an older man rehearsing the vigor of youth, a vigor he cannot fully possess for long. And in point of fact, in a handful of years, he would be showing signs of dementia, which would harry him for 2 decades. Conventionally, mid to late 20th century, visual media curate the image of the poet more fastidiously as a charismatic celebrity asserting himself or herself in meaningful symbolic activities. I think of the 1952 interview, the film interview of Robert Frost that begins with Frost feeding hay to horses. By contrast, step back. Those visual media tend to announce that the poet performs a valuable service to society. By contrast, situating the poet in the most modest room of the house, struggling to invoke the sacred in his pajamas, is naive, and yet serendipitously defiant for 1959. And this defiantly pedestrian treatment, which at times verges on mockery, chimes with heroic humility of the poem, and asserts that poetry is a private, deeply humbling devotion, perhaps even childish or foolish, a foolish old world record of our life. And that the poet is inherently nothing, or as Yeats put it, a tattered coat upon a stick. Paradoxically, for Robert Graves, a tattered coat even while soul clap its hands and sing. So, to answer my question, no. I don't think the film would be significantly different or impaired if Graves were whistling, not reading. Visually, the film enacts the poem's essential meanings, although in its own unique idiom, and while often maddeningly at cross purposes to the poetic text, it comports satisfactorily with the poet's inspiration and characteristic poetics.